I love so many things about North Dakota, and one of the things I love the best is how anxious we are to help one another. You see it all the time. You've seen the traffic jams at entryways when you're trying to go into a restaurant or a building as people stop to hold the doors open for one another. If you've ever stopped alongside one of our roads to take a picture or a phone call or to change a tire, you've probably had multiple people stop just to make sure you don't need any help. Another way North Dakotans can show kindness to their neighbors is by getting vaccinated. Vaccinations keep vulnerable people safe from severe illness and death. They keep our economy running by keeping our businesses open. They help us stay mentally healthy by allowing us to connect with others through church events or community groups. They also keep our healthcare workers safe and on the job. Getting vaccinated is a choice you can make to help your neighbors, your community, and your state. So talk to your doctor about it and follow their advice to get the vaccinations that will help keep you and all the people you care about healthy and happy. To learn more, go to spreadlovenotcovidnd.org, a website set up by the North Dakota State University Center for Immunization Research and Education.
Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month. You'll get unlimited access to the news you need to stay engaged and connected to your community. Visit inforum.com/subscribe now to get 3 months of local news for only 99 cents a month.
Welcome to Plain Talking. Boy, we're going to have a busy show today. I'm going to start off. I'll be interviewing North Dakota Attorney General Drew Wrigley here. We're going to talk about mandatory minimums, the impact that will or will not have on our cost of incarceration. We're also going to talk a little bit about the crime lab. Then coming up later in the show, we're also going to be talking with Sean Cleary, State Senator Sean Cleary, about pensions, which has been a hot topic at the legislature. But we're going to start with Drew. And by the way, is a little unusual. We're so busy. We got so many guests. My co-host Ben Hansen will be joining me when we have Sean Cleary on. We're going to be recording that a little bit later in the day. But for right now, it's just me and Drew. And we're going to talk. Drew, let's first of all, thanks for coming on. And second, let's start with the crime lab. I think that's kind of a two-pronged issue. One, you wanted a little bit of a change in the org chart around the crime lab. You wanted to move it under BCI. The other part of it is you're also asking for as part of an overall budget request, you're asking for the legislature to put a lot more resources into the crime lab. Where are we at on those two issues?
Right. Rob, thanks for the opportunity to be here. I guess we would put this in the category of breaking news on one of these topics in that, that's the nature of the legislative process. You bring in ideas and you go forward. It's critical that people understand the crime lab already reports to the Attorney General directly. The director of the crime lab is a direct report to the Attorney General. The director of the BCI is a direct report to the Attorney General. I have 14 different divisions with a division director, and they all report directly to me. We all meet routinely together here in my office every other week. We meet for a few hours. During the session, we meet every week. This is already a direct report situation. What we were seeking, what the current form of Senate Bill 2131, just the simple adjustment of reorganizing the chairs at the table. And I was planning to have the director of the lab, have that person report over up and through the chain through the BCI, as is done in 43 other states, as is done by the FBI, as is done by the ATF, as is done all over this United States in large police departments and sheriff's departments when they have their own labs. It's a very routine matter, so that you ensure always, and we will always ensure the science remains distinct. It's always objectively founded on excellent science with the right technology and the right redundancies and have you. Those aren't matters of controversy. I've been doing this work off and on in federal and state courts for 30 years. I'm well aware of the fact that science isn't worth anything to you if it's not objective and sound. And of course, we would never do anything to undermine that, just like the other 43 states that do it exactly this way. But it has to be something else. It has to also be responsive. And that what leads me to the why. Like, why we're reconsidering that particular proposal in conjunction with all the additional resources we're seeking. Because this goes back about 18 months. When I first started going around the state to talk with stakeholders in law enforcement about issues in law enforcement here in North Dakota and other issues that would bear on my work as Attorney General if I eventually ran and got elected. Well, everywhere I went, 100% of the sheriffs and deputies that I spoke with, and the police chiefs and rank and file law enforcement, 100%. They brought up the crime lab all the time. Backlogs at the crime lab, communication problems between law enforcement and the crime lab, the kind of things that I thought completely unacceptable roadblocks to the investigations, and then prosecutions were merited in our state. And we're dealing at this at a time where public safety is coming into a matter of concern. We've got an significant upticks in violent crime generally across the state of North Dakota. And so you can't have some issue, I'll call it a side issue like that, like backlogs in a lab creating a problem. This goes back years. And all sorts of challenges. I'm being told about cases that aren't being charged fully. The fact that you can't test firearms in North Dakota. You can't get latent prints. That's just basic crime lab work that I can't explain why it was cut back in 2017. They didn't seek to add it back in 19. They didn't seek to add it back in 21. I was just down in a hearing here a couple of minutes ago. We're seeking to have those added back into our budget so that we can test firearms.
As an anecdote to your point, one thing that a criminal defense attorney told me, or somebody who works in criminal defense told me last week, is that we've had there's so much backlog at the crime lab that we've had situations where criminal cases are being pled out before the forensics evidence is back in, which seems, I mean, whatever side you're on, the prosecution side, the defense side, I think all of us are on the side of justice, and I don't know that justice is served as well as it could be by a situation like that. So
couldn't say it better myself. And so that's just not going to, I knew before I became Attorney General that was going to be at the top of the priority list. And then as it turned out, I became Attorney General faster than I had hoped, obviously. So now I've been here for almost a year, and I've been having meetings all over the state. I don't think any of your listeners have any reason to question that this is a clear and present complication and danger to law enforcement in the state of North Dakota. So we were seeking through that bill. In addition, we're seeking a bunch of resources. It's a very significant increase. I want to have, and we're requesting, and we're getting nothing but support, lots and lots of support from the legislature on having the ability to test firearms in North Dakota instead of finding some, the state's attorney has to find some lab down in Missouri and charges $8,000 to get a gun tested. And then you have to fly a bunch of extra witnesses up here. It's ridiculous expense. And I don't know why we got to this point, but here we are, and we're going to fix it. So we're getting support for getting those firearms examiners and getting latent print examiners again. We've got the equipment. I visited the equipment down at the lab. We just don't have anybody to do it. So we're seeking those FTEs. We expect to get them. We're also seeking additions to our scientists in the lab. We need 3 more. They tell me to deal with this and then maintain the workflow that we need to have for law enforcement and to further public safety in the state. We were seeking 3 additional scientists. We're also seeking the dollars necessary to add on physically to the lab to be able to accommodate these new personnel. So that's not a matter of controversy, but what sparked up was the idea that, people didn't want to get their head around the fact that we wanted to just rearrange the chairs in my organizational chart and have the lab report up through law enforcement, as is done routinely all around the United States. And the reason I wanted to do that is I want to make sure that in addition to sound science, we're always going to have that. In addition to excellent scientists, we're always going to insist on that. We have workflow that doesn't become a burden to law enforcement. So we came here, though, and it's one of those situations where there's been some dust up about the whole thing. I see it becoming a side issue of, some people are so confused about it. Frankly, Rob, they're saying, the crime lab should remain separate from the Attorney General's office. Well, that would take a whole new piece of legislation. Right. It already comes here.
Although it was written in specifically. I mean, there is a specific statute, and it was obviously done very intentionally. And when I originally wrote about it, I went back and quoted your predecessor, Wayne Stenjum, who testified to the legislature at the time how important that independence was. So essentially, you've moved on. You're saying, I don't want to jeopardize all the additional resources we need with this side debate about the org chart. You're moving on from that. Going to leave the crime lab organized as the status quo and move on to the resource question.
Right. Exactly right. We're going to, well, not quite status quo. We're going to be seeking an additional person who we're going to term an operations manager. He or she will have knowledge in operations and will work hand in glove with the director of the lab and the lab personnel to make sure that they are aware of workflow needs and prioritization needs, and with law enforcement across the state of North Dakota. And frankly, that law enforcement understands too that there are limits to how rapidly these things can move along. It'll be a nice, not an ombudsman, I mean, really a practical day-by-day hands-on operations manager that will serve the interests and maintain the independence. And by the way, the independence was always going to be maintained. And I understand that some, frankly, it was a misquote of my predecessor when they came in there. But again, my predecessor and I have different backgrounds. I'm the first prosecutor to occupy this office since 1984 when Al Olson left to become governor. He was the last person who had any background at all as a prosecutor. Now, I've spent 30 years as a prosecutor. It doesn't make me infallible, but it makes me highly sensitive to the issues of independence. I understand all that, but I don't know much about politics, but I do know unnecessary battles are just that.
Pick your battles.
Necessary. So we're going to avoid that.
That might be lesson one of politics, right? Pick your battles.
We're going to avoid that, and we've had a good reception to that. I mentioned it in the hearing this morning. This is the first that any news outlet has asked about the question and that amendment. We've gone to the sponsor of the bill, and I talked to her, Senator Yana Myrdal, and the others, and then also to the majority leaders to let them know that that's just a matter we're going to have go by the wayside. And you know what? They're really supportive of the resources that we're seeking for the lab, though, and elsewhere around the office, and we're happy about that.
The issue caught my eye. I don't know how many other people are even reporting about it, but it caught my eye. I thought it was important, and but now it's a moot point.
Rob, you were two things. You were wrong, and you won.
All right, fair enough. I disagree with part of that sentence. What's the issue of having a operations person, I think, is really interesting, because one thing, and I know that you're in the process of moving on from, or have moved on from the previous director, and I know you don't want to comment about personnel issues, but outside looking in, I perceive that there's two separate skill sets if you're going to be the director of a crime lab. There's the science, and you want somebody who's got a good scientific background, who's rigorous on the science. For sure. But also you need somebody who's a good administrator, and those are distinct skill sets. And a person can be good at both, but a person's not necessarily good at both. And so I'm wondering, is that you're bringing in a controller is kind of separating the skill sets a little bit and maybe allowing the director to focus more on science while the controller focuses more on administration? Am I perceiving that right?
Yep. Nope, that's well articulated. I should have had you down there testifying for me on that. That's the plan. Yeah, I mean, that's what we're going to do. And we wouldn't, we'll hire that person. If the legislature approves that operations manager, we'll hire that person hand in glove with the needs of the lab. And we will definitely involve the director, whoever that is at the time, or the interim director. We've got a woman right now who's been a lead, a team leader down there, and she's agreed to take on the responsibilities. Jennifer Penner, and she's doing a really nice job. We really appreciate it. It's enhanced communication in significant ways, and we just got to a point where the situation was no longer tenable, and so I removed the previous lab director. It just got I'll leave it at that. It wasn't any longer tenable, and we move forward. And I appreciate the team leaders down there stepping into the leadership role, and then one in particular taking on the role of the interim director. And when the time comes to hire an operations manager, that'll be their most important work will be how they work really, really well with that the leader of the lab. And then facilitate the work between law enforcement, because we're seeking a lot of more resources, Rob, for the BCI, our agents, the technology that we have down there, the equipment that's needed in the BCI, placement of some agents around the state near our tribal lands on our reservations, at the invitation of the tribes, by the way, because they're completely underserved populations, and the Department of the Interior is just not going to meet that need. They're just not going to. And so we're not going to wait around for that any longer. The BCI, we've got a proposal, and we're getting wonderful reception from the legislature. BCI is out working on arrangements to work hand in glove with sheriff's departments, police departments, tribal law enforcement that's in place, all with the agreement and only at the invitation of tribal leadership, where at all. And so we've got that first agreement was signed up at Spirit Lake, and we're working on similar agreements with the other tribes. And by the way, the tribe will always maintain, obviously they're sovereigns, and they've got the ability, if they decide that those arrangements aren't working as they'd hope, they have the ability to end them whenever they wish.
Well,
so we really feel positive. It's going to be a positive development for all of law enforcement in the state, frankly.
Well, I think that's the next thing to talk about is obviously you've made a big ask of the legislature, and I think a needed ask. I hope you get what you're looking for. Our crime lab, which we've just been discussing, needs more people, needs more resources. Your office needs a lot of resources. I don't. There's a need here, and I don't think that your request obviously is spurious. I think it addresses real needs that the state of North Dakota has. You're also though asking for, and with $24 million, is that the number I have right? Roughly, you're asking the legislature for your office.
$24 million above the previous.
Right.
Yes,
increase.
It's about a 20, depending on how you look at it, 28% increase,
Sure.
and which is, not something I take lightly. I'm a pretty conservative person, but
Right.
Also I think of our office in very real way as as similar on the federal side to the Defense Department, which also should not have an unscrutinized budget. Our budget is being scrutinized. We've made ourselves available. My chief deputy, Claire Ness, and I have met, and along with our budget people, so many different legislators around the last 6 months, 7 months, our division directors building this budget, and then standing behind it in an accountable way, just like we did this morning in another hearing, letting them know we're not asking for five FTEs when we really just need 3. We're not overshooting the moon. A couple of senators and Republican senators just asked us, "Are you sure? Are you asking for enough? Should you have asked for additional salary dollars here?" And we let them know we want to restructure our salary structure so that we can compete within the government, which we really, by and large, too often can't do right now.
Well, that's one thing. I mean, your office has to hire a lot of lawyers. Lawyers can make a lot of money in the private sector. So you're competing with the private sector, asking people.
And with government, Rob, we're losing them to other government entities, and so. And we've got a situation, give you an example. Our Medicaid fraud unit, we've got one lawyer. She's also the director. She's the lawyer. She does all civil intake, criminal intake, and oversees the entire unit. She tries any cases that come along, and she's won some. That Medicaid fraud unit, which is 75% paid by federal government, 25% by the state, just in the months that I've been here, I've just been kind of scratching down the numbers as I go along. In the 11 months that I've been here, they've already brought back in enough fraudulently obtained funds, and then they bring them back from the fraudsters. They brought back enough money just in those 11 months to pay for the entire biennium, for the entire unit.
Yeah.
All the lawyers, everybody, because there's that, and they're leaving lots of fraud cases uninvestigated because they don't have the time to do it. So we're asking for one more lawyer, one more investigator, one more paralegal, and that'll more than pay for itself. And that's even, that's not even just because the federal government pays 3/4 of it. So, that's fraud that's going undetected. We're not doing that because it's going to be a moneymaker thing. That's not the objective, but it's that we want to, Medicaid costs are skyrocketing, and these fraud units, North Dakota was the last to put one in place here a couple of years ago. And, they're doing important work. So that's just one example where we're quantifying what we expect to gain. Also adding civil litigators. The state of North Dakota, the last many years, the state has expended, we've got in our budget $4.6 million to hire outside lawyers at really dramatically higher costs than what it would cost you to have a good litigator here. We've got several good litigators. They're just not even nearly enough to do the amount of work that we have to respond to lawsuits or bringing lawsuits on behalf of the energy interest in the state, agriculture.
Well, an example of that came up at yesterday's Industrial Commission meeting, which you're a member of, obviously, where several years ago, the state of North Dakota won a lengthy lawsuit with Minnesota when Minnesota was trying to regulate interstate commerce. The court said, no, can't do that. Congress regulates interstate commerce because Minnesota was trying to ban coal-fired power being imported. There's another bill to do something similar before the Minnesota legislature, and if they pass it, I hope they don't. I hope they amend it. But if they pass it, North Dakota's going to be in litigation again. And,
absolutely.
Do we have the resources to do that, or do we have to hire some $1,000 an hour outside counsel?
That's the dilemma, Rob. And then, are they, for a few tens of thousands of dollars more, we can keep litigators on board here who will say, I want to be in public service, they may say, but they can't possibly afford to take some of the opportunities lost by not.
Well, it's hard to blame anybody for wanting to make the most,
right.
Maximize, what they get for themselves and their family. I mean, that's the American dream, right? Well, complicating some of this is, I don't want to say that's the wrong way to put it. You have another bill where you're asking for mandatory minimum sentences for some crimes. This is not an across the board mandatory minimums. It's for gun related crimes, is how my colleague April Baumgarten described it in her article today.
Yes.
It has a fiscal note tagged to as $28.2 million, which is a few million more than your overall budget increase. And for people who don't know, a fiscal note is where it's an estimate of essentially what what a bill is going to cost. So in this instance, they're estimating that because we have, we're going to mandate that people have to serve out minimum sentences, that's obviously going to have an impact on corrections costs. Now the problem though is that a lot of times these fiscal notes can be controversial because there's a lot of ways to skin at. And there's a saying in the legislature called a death by fiscal note,
right, where
if they don't want to pass a bill, a state agency will come along and hang a big price tag on it that'll scare support away. Right. You're saying, you said to April Baumgarten today that that's what's going on with this bill.
It's absolutely what's going on with this bill. There's no question about it. Before I get to the fiscal note about it, let's just so your listeners are aware, the crimes. It's a very narrow focus on a very narrow set of crimes. Violent crimes committed with firearms. Violent crimes committed with firearms, mandatory sentences that the defendant would serve, and that it's in direct response to the significant, I would say, dramatic uptick in violent crime in North Dakota in recent years. It's trending upwards. It will again when we get the crime stats for 2022. It will go up again. These kind of crimes are way too common. Everybody sees it. They see it in the paper every day. They're living it. We're losing a degree of our quality of life over it. There's no question about that. And so what this addresses is also the men and women in uniform that I've been talking with for years about these matters. They come back too fast. When you get sentenced in the federal system on these things, you get a sentence that's mandatory, and you serve it. Here in North Dakota, and DOCR will deny this, by the way, but this is what happens. They get sentenced to a crime. They come out here. It's not a mandatory sentence. They come out, and whatever the amount of time is, the cops and the sheriff's deputies and everyone will tell you they're back a heck of a lot faster than that because they don't serve the whole sentence. They get released early, and then they call it other things. They put a title on it where they make it seem like, they're still under the control of the DOCR. But they're living in a halfway house, or they're back in their community and they don't even have a probation officer. No, it's unacceptable. These criminals, and they're getting arrested over and over and over. And so what this says is, if you commit a violent crime in North Dakota and you have a firearm in your possession, you will automatically get sentenced not only for the violent crime, but on the end of that, consecutive to whatever sentence you get on that, you have a mandatory. The judge has to give you 3 more years just for having a firearm on you when you committed that rape, when you committed that aggravated assault or that burglary or some other violent crime. And then if you brandish the weapon. Let's say you rape a woman at gunpoint and you hold the gun to her head. You terrorize her with that gun while you're raping her. They get sentenced on the rape, and hopefully they get a long sentence. But then on the end of that, they get another 5 years mandatory, and you have to serve 85% of it if you're a perfect prisoner. You have to serve 85. DOCR has no authority to find some bureaucratic way to send you back out there because they say, we don't have enough jail cells.
So you're saying this problem, as you perceive it, is originating with DOCR? Because I've had a lot of feedback from, frankly, judges who feel like you're putting some of the blame with them, that they're not following sentences, and they point to a report. They have to file a report with the court system every year about deviations from. We have some suggested minimums but judges have discretion. Right. It doesn't happen very often, at least according to these reports. You're saying the problems at the Department of Corrections, they're letting the prisoners out too quickly. Problems.
I've talked to some judges too, and they don't appreciate when they give a sentence and a person goes out to they got a violent criminal in front of them, and the judge is in a place, and they look through the pre-sentence report, they go through the whole thing. They maybe seen this defendant a few other times, and they give him a lengthy sentence. And then that person's back in the system in a year and a half, and they were sentenced to 4 years. They got let out early and they came back. It happens all over the state. I'm not, that's not even anecdotal. It happens all the time. No one even really denies it. They come up with different names for it. I mean, my chief deputy and I had my office filled with former probation and parole officers. It was head spinning how many different ways they said the DOCR releases people and have them come back, and it doesn't show up in the statistics. And yet everyone in law enforcement knows that it's happening. Just look at the raps. I've started this with our cases as they're coming right now. I've told BCI when they're calling me, as they do every day, you get a text message about the latest horrible crime going on in North Dakota. They keep us updated on that with the chief deputy and me for good reasons. As the head of the BCI, I need to know those things. And so I get those updates and I want to know right away, what's their record? Never very surprising. When someone's committing a violent offense with a firearm, it's almost never the first rodeo. And they've been out there, they've been in and out of the system over and over and over. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to offer up, those are mandatory sentences. They are consecutive to the violent crime sentence. So the public knows people committing violent crimes using firearms are actually going to prison for a set amount of time. The judge doesn't have any discretion. DOC, they do on the front end. They can't go any lower than that, by the way. Mandatory minimum just means that. They're free to give them more years if they want. And they got to serve 85% of that time for that subset of crimes. It is a standalone, bad, dangerous, community undermining act to use a firearm in the furtherance of what is already a violent offense. And people are sick of it with good reason. And plenty of judges are sick of these people coming back too quickly too. This is truth in sentencing. This is transparency in sentencing. And it will lead to something really important. The crimes that never happen, that you'll never see on a statistic, because some gun-wielding maniac who's out there and who's getting sentenced and has to serve that time, the best statistic is 0. They will commit 0 violent acts with a firearm while they're incarcerated in our state prison. 0 women will get raped by that person at gunpoint, and so on, right down the line. The fiscal note on this thing.
Well, I was going to ask about that because of cost.
Completely false and ignoring the situation. Let me put it this way, so we can, for ease of an example. Let's say that the prison had 100 jail cells. Okay, you got 100 jail cells at the state prison. Well, today, on average, there would be 7 of those would be filled by people who are there for just drug possession. Now, I'm not saying that's not a significant crime, but just drug possession alone. 7%. 17%. 17 out of those 100 jail cells are filled by people who committed nonviolent offenses. Not saying that they shouldn't be in jail, but I'm saying there they are. We do have finite resources. That is true. But that has become an excuse for everybody's rotating in and out without society being able to speak to the issue of who's at the front of this line. Who definitely is occupying those spots?
I think that's really important that you draw distinctions between a violent crime versus a crime where I had a whole bunch of fentanyl because I'm a drug addict and I wasn't really hurting anybody but myself. I think it's important to draw some of those distinctions, which made me wonder. Senator David Hogue, Senate Majority Leader from Minot, he has mandatory minimums that would address. He's out to address drug crimes, fentanyl, opioids,
right?
And his even I think has a mandatory minimum for delivery, which I had one defense attorney describe to me saying, "Listen, if one addict gives some pills to another addict, now you got a minimum sentence." Do you support his bill? I mean, because to me that's very distinct. You're targeting violent crime, gun-related crime. He's targeting maybe not explicitly violent crime. How do you feel about his bill?
Yeah, I haven't read through it yet. I'm going to, and then I'll be able to give you more of a detailed analysis from my perspective, which I'll be open about it. But Senator Hogue is addressing a very, very troubling problem in the state. We see this. I mean, overdose deaths and overdoses that they're able to avoid the death are mind-numbing. What those numbers are like across the state of North Dakota and across the United States. This is one of the top killers in the United States is drug overdose, and in fentanyl. I'm telling you, people understand when this is going on in all of our communities. They understand it's you can be one and done. You don't have to be an addict who's like rolled up in the ditch, snorting coke and your heart gives out. This can be a one-time deal. It's such a lethal narcotic, and I know that Senator Hogue, we haven't talked about that bill. We'll get a chance to here in the days ahead. But he's trying, and responsive to the community and to law enforcement, trying to deal with that in the most effective way possible. Now that's going to get a lot of hearings, and there'll be a lot of input, and I'll maybe give some input on it too. I'm glad to. Senator Hoag's a friend and a longtime colleague, both in my time as lieutenant governor and now here in this role. And we've had some really constructive meetings on other bills, including my bills, but I have not talked to him about that one yet. I look forward to it because I think the hearing process is going to be critical there to find out where are the appropriate points for the conduct you just described. Some people might say, gosh, that shouldn't be quite the same as somebody who's delivering, a whole box full of fentanyl to somebody. And those are the kind of things that come out in a hearing, and you can figure that out. Law enforcement and the discretion of prosecutors can deal with all of those matters. I'm glad that he's got a bill out there to take on this important issue, and I look forward to being part of
I'm happy to have the debate, but I think obviously, I guess brings us back to my last question. You don't like the fiscal note that's been tagged on your mandatory minimum bills. There's going to be a cost, right? I mean, you can't.
Rob, there's going to be a cost, but a lot of them are fixed costs. Look at this. It doesn't cost me anymore. It doesn't cost the government. It doesn't cost the public, the taxpayer anymore for me to be trying a case or working on a brief.
Yeah, sure. You get it's the sunk costs, right? You're
thing with the court system.
You're paying for
I read in April's article, and she did a nice job on her article. It wasn't her, but I mean, I read their commentary about it. They're literally going out there and acting like, oh, those jail cells would be empty. We wouldn't have to have prosecutors. We wouldn't have to have any of these people if we didn't have these mandatory minimums. And you know what else we won't have? We won't have those same people committing multiple crimes in that same 5-year span. They'll be committing one. They won't have to get prosecuted 3 times. There won't be 3 people who got pistol whipped. There won't be 3 sets of judges who had to address that person. Those people, this bill says they're first. Violent criminals committing these violent acts with firearms, you're in for a fixed amount of time. If the prison system has to deal with the crowding issue, if you got to deal with it and the policymakers decide they don't want to add more space, then deal with it with nonviolent offenders, deal with it with people who, marijuana possessors or whatever else they've got. I'll tell you what, I am not going to be backed off on this on some phony, which is what it is, fiscal note that totals the cost. I went through this same thing when I was the U.S. attorney and I was personally prosecuting the Rodriguez death penalty case. And the opponents constantly wanted to talk about what it was costing, all this money. The only there were some additional costs. But they wanted to know, how much do you get paid and how much do your other 2 lawyers who are working on this with you get paid? I said, what difference does it make? I cut my salary in half because we were working such crazy hours for so long on that case. We didn't get paid a nickel more. It didn't change at all what the costs of my office were. And the jail cell that Alfonso Rodriguez occupies to this day on death row in Terre Haute, Indiana, hey, 3 times he targeted and raped women across the years, and then he's earned initially a death sentence, and now they've converted that. The system decided it wanted to convert that. We'll see if the Biden administration appeals. I'll tell you what, people have had it, and these are nothing but bureaucrat excuses when they come out like, oh, this is going to cost a lot of money, and they're just throwing together costs that are fixed, that they're already paying, and our bill says to the bureaucracy and to others.
Have you done an estimate?
Lock up violent criminals.
Sure. I agree with you. And there is a problem with expanding fiscal notes and things. I remember there was a speed limit bill several sessions ago, and the Department of Transportation came in and said, well, if we raise the speed limit 5 miles an hour, we're going to have to lengthen every off ramp in the state. Obviously, I think they had like a $200 million fiscal note on it. Obviously not rooted in reality. So I understand your concern. Have you done any analysis on because I do think, though, it's a fair question to ask. How are we going to, if we're going to put more people in jail, how do we deal with it? Right? Do we have a plan in place to, reprioritize the people we're putting in? So I guess that's my last question. Have you done any sort of an analysis on the fiscal impact in your office?
No, we're looking, like I said, that's our analysis. Our analysis is this is just a prioritization of who's already going to be in the prison out there. It's a recognition that we've got an uptick in these crimes, and that I don't have any meaningful way to say, okay, this is the number of crimes we're going to save by these people being locked up. There's not a meaningful way to do that, but we know for sure that it exists because these are all recidivist offenders. We know that that's the case. I'm not asking for an addition on the prisons, so there aren't going to be more nonviolent criminals being locked up out there. What we're going to see is a reprioritization, and it's going to be society saying, start with the violent criminals. So I don't accept at all that there's going to be significant additional costs. I don't accept that, not for a minute. The other thing is they said, everybody's going to go to trial now. Well, I've been a prosecutor off and on for 30 years. And I like trying cases myself. I don't get paid any different if I'm trying a case versus if I'm pleading a case out. And the other thing to note about that is there aren't going to be a significant increase in the number of these sentences, or a number of trials. There just are not going to be, because the prosecutor always has the discretion to mandatorize, if you will, these cases with a binding plea agreement. They can always say to the defendant who's facing a mandatory 5 years consecutive to the rape or the robbery or whatever else they're doing, they can always say, plead guilty today. Here's our evidence. Our evidence is strong. You're going to get convicted. Plead guilty today, and you get 4 years mandatory. And then we'll have a binding plea agreement, and then the court can either accept that or not. If they accept it, the guy goes for 4 years. You save the trial. You move the cases along. This happens every day in courtroom. It's not any different. There's nothing different about this. It is absolutely nothing but a boogeyman when they say, everything's going to have to go to trial. I even heard a couple states attorneys say that. Say, now everything's going to have to go to trial. I think they, with due respect, they're going to have to think through their particular workload a little more. They every day are making these decisions. And what this is going to do is have the authority on these matters with the people through their elected officials, saying, whatever the judge's discretion is, and it can be higher, you cannot go below 3 years if they're possessing a firearm, 5 years if they commit a violent act while using the firearm to terrorize.
Although to be clear, judges already aren't going. I think we talked about earlier, the issue is really when they're put in the correction systems. The correction system is saying, okay, you're here for 30. Now you're out on parole.
The sentences aren't not all. I want to say all. Too often, the sentences aren't. I don't think reflect what society's wishes are in this regard. And now you hear that again and again too. People should watch these cases very closely. Seems to be a lot of news coverage when someone gets arrested on a horrible gun case here in the state of North Dakota. There's a fair amount of coverage, and then as things go by, sometimes it takes a little time, and there's not quite. I always have to. I like to check up on things like whatever happened in that case. And then you go and you look, and there's not as much conversation about, what sentence did they actually get? Because sometimes it's not that impressive. And it's remarkable to me the number of times that they don't even put the judge's name in the article. Why not? The judge must be really proud of their sentence. They passed it. They should be out there. I'll tell you what, this system, we need more transparency about it. We need more sunlight on it. And this is a truth in sentencing provision as much as anything else. It's about public safety, truth in sentencing. And I stand by it. And I got a beautiful letter yesterday from the chiefs of police all across this state. Absolutely great endorsement letter for 2107. I'm told there's a similar letter coming in from the sheriffs. Law enforcement, they've had it. They're risking their lives. They're out there risking their lives, trying to protect the communities. And they are encountering these people over and over and over. Jesse Johnner and I had a conversation about this. He made the best point.
Cass County Sheriff Jesse Johnner.
Yep. He made a phenomenal point on this whole thing. He's the one who made the point to me about, Drew, can you imagine these guys who are going to get 5 and 7 years as a matter of these things? We'll avoid 2 or 3 arrests on them. That's 2 or 3 fewer victims, 2 or 3 times men and women in uniform aren't risking their lives to make the arrests. And, there's no way to calculate that cost. You talk about incalculable. That's a benefit to society and a benefit to law enforcement and a benefit to our communities that are losing their peace of mind because of this stuff. And it's time to turn the corner and go back toward a more enhanced public safety picture in our state.
Well, we went about 15 minutes over our scheduled time, so I appreciate you being so generous with your time, Drew.
I'm glad to do it.
I'm not complaining, but I don't want to take up any more of your time. Certainly appreciate it, Drew.
Thanks for the opportunity, Rob. I look forward to talking with you up the road.
Hi there, my name is James Wallner. I produce and host the podcast Dakota Spotlight, a true crime podcast that tackles historical and unsolved crimes in the upper Midwest. Follow along with me as we search for a missing girl, attempt to solve a 45-year-old murder, and much, much more. That's Dakota Spotlight Podcast, anywhere you get your podcasts, or at inforum.com/podcasts.
Okay, so now welcome to the second part of today's episode of Plain Talk. I just finished up my interview with Attorney General Drew Wrigley. Some interesting things about the crime lab, breaking some news there, where he's gonna drop his request that the crime lab be organized under the Bureau of Criminal Investigation, which created some concerns about independence from observers such as myself. But we finished that. I'm joined now by my co-host Ben Hansen and State Senator Sean Cleary. And now, prop your eyelids open. We're going to talk about pensions because this is going to be scintillating. Although you may want to pay attention because this is very important, not just for our public workers, right? I mean, North Dakota, we need to be able to recruit public workers. And I will tell you that one thing, although I support moving away from a defined benefit plan, I will tell you one thing that concerns me about doing that is our ability to attract workers. Whatever else you want to say about a defined benefit pension plans, they're great for workers. Workers love them, and I don't blame them. They're a great deal for them. I'm not convinced they're a good deal for the taxpayers, but that's part of this debate. Anyway, joining us, like I said, Senator Sean Cleary. And to set the stage on this a little bit, I should know Governor Burgum, has called out this issue. He has said that he wants to move away from a defined benefit pension. He also wants to put some money into the existing pension to try to shore it up. It's underfunded. He wants to shore it up. He wants the public workers to put in some money as well, but also he wants us to transition away. Senator Cleary has a proposal which essentially, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, would essentially do all the shoring up without transitioning us away. And his argument is that's actually a cheaper cost, a cheaper way to do it. So here, to make that case, Senator Cleary, did I get all that right?
Yeah, Rob, thanks for having me on. And Ben, hello to you too. That was a good summary of it. And I would say that it's also important to listeners, just not only for the impact on state employees, but just the dollar signs involved when we talk about, responsible use of the public's money. So excited to be part of this debate, and yeah, happy to answer any questions about the path forward here.
Senator Cleary, you're a freshman senator taking on a big issue here. I say let's set the stage even more for folks who are listening in. Can you give me, not to sit and quiz you, but I don't know if everybody knows, what is our public sector workforce and how many openings have we seen sort of, it's your definition of long-term opening, but we have a lot of long-term openings in the private sector, say, where I am at in the Fargo-Moorhead area, and I'm guessing so in Bismarck, but how many slots do we have that we need to fill in right now?
That's a good question, Ben. I don't have the exact numbers off the top of my head. I would say that the state, like a lot of employers, both big and small, struggles with workforce recruitment and retainment right now. We just have a really tight labor market. We're a state that in some ways has even additional challenges to get people to stay here and come here. And the state is definitely struggling with that as well. So when we talk about the different benefits and salary available, as part of compensation, the pension is definitely a big part of that. It's a competitive benefit and something that state employees place a high value on.
You know what?
Senator Cleary, go ahead, Rob.
No, well, I guess what I wanted to ask is it seems like there's a consensus that we got to put some money in to and what we're talking about, by the way, it's called PERS. It's the Public Employee Retirement System, PERS. And it's separate from, there's another one, it's TFFR, that's the Teachers Fund for Retirement. That's a separate issue. So we're not talking about teachers, we're talking about public workers. And I think there's a consensus that everybody understands that we got to put some money because there's an unfunded liability that's closing in on like $2 billion.
I'd actually like Senator Cleary to speak more of that. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Rob,
sure.
But I think that is worth talking about as well. But please finish your point, but let's put a pin in that.
Well, I guess, yeah. I mean, there's a feeling that we've got to put more money in, so that's going to come from an appropriation from the taxpayers. I think there's a feeling that some of that should also come from the employees putting some of their portion in. Everybody agrees on that. The point of disagreement is, should we move away from a defined benefit pension? And I guess maybe I need to set the stage even more. A defined benefit pension is where you're guaranteed a payout, right? And this is, historically, it was very common among unions. They've almost disappeared from the private sector. Kind of the last bastion of them is the government. But essentially, a defined benefit pension is where you're guaranteed a payout for your retirement. This is as opposed to a defined contribution, which most of us that work in the private sector, we're familiar with that, where you have a 401k or an IRA, and what's defined is your employer's going to match a certain amount of money that you put in, or they're going to contribute a certain amount of money. That's defined contribution versus defined benefit. And Sean, having talked way too much, let's hear from you now.
Yeah, Rob and Ben, you're both definitely correct that there is consensus growing around the fact that there is a large liability. I think it was 1.9 billion that the pension is underfunded, and so from all the stakeholders involved, there's definitely a consensus there that we need to do something. And as part of Governor Burgum's staff in 2019, we did propose changes that would help improve solvency for the pension. It's been something that's been discussed nearly every session. And if you ask a lot of folks who've been around here for longer than me, we have asked state employees to pay their portion. We've even reduced benefits to new folks coming onto the plan, and in order to improve the solvency. And so the changes that I guess are being proposed by both myself and governor's office and Representative LaFleur, all those acknowledge that we need to do something in order to make sure that this is solvent and keeps the promise that we've made to state employees and retirees.
Senator Cleary, I did want to address this liability that Rob is talking about. The governor in his, I'm sorry, is that State of the State or budget address? Is it budget address at the beginning of session?
State of the State was at the beginning of the session, and the budget address was about a month before.
All right, my apologies. And I believe in both you referenced it, but I know for sure on the budget address, he spoke about $1.9 billion being the liability. Now, a lot of government numbers sound very, very big when you isolate them and take them out of context. On a simple level, if someone's trying to afford something and they don't have that much money in the bank, you're short however many dollars that fund is. But what is truly meant by $1.9 billion as a liability? And what I mean by that is we are clearly paying the pensions of retired public employees right now. We will be this year, we will be next year. That's part of a commitment the state's made to them. No one is saying we aren't. So where is this 1.9 billion falling short? What is the projection on it? And I will add my personal commentary. When I was there, I was very frustrated, and I'm painting in broad strokes, but not inaccurate ones, at predictions made by OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, that frequently changed by quite a significant amount projected revenue coming into the state almost immediately after, say, legislative sessions. And as a further national flavor, I personally was very frustrated and still am with the Bush era policy of making something on a federal level like the post office be solvent for something like 50 years out in a way that no other department, DOD, Department of Justice, has to. Can you give us some context comparison? What is this liability? Where do we start falling short? I know it's not next year. Is it 1.9 billion over the course of 10 years? What is the urgency that has brought this to the table and results in that number?
So that number reflects the difference between the amount of future benefits calculated that we owe and then the amount available to pay them. And, these are conversations that happen over the course of decades. And so it's not like we owe $1.9 billion tomorrow, or we're not going to be able to pay the benefits. And in fact, one of the advantages we have, both in a situation like mine, where I'm seeking to keep the plan open, but also to folks who want to make it solvent and move to a different plan, is that it's something that we address over the course of 20 or 30 years. In my bill, we increased the contributions from the state over the course of 30 years. And when you spread that out over the course of that time frame, it makes the financial difficulties a little more doable, because you're getting the fund moving in the right direction in order to make sure we can meet those obligations and do it in a responsible way to taxpayers.
But what is the year that the 1.9 billion adds up to? Is that over the course of the next 10 years? It's not the course of next year. What is the time being estimated for that 1.9 billion to land on 1.9 billion as the dollar amount that we have in liability?
I don't have the chart in front of me, but it's decades from now. It wouldn't even be within the next 30 years. It's trending downward. The liability is growing, which is definitely a place you don't want to be, and why I think action is especially warranted this session. But we're not in a situation where within the next 30 years, even if we did nothing, which I would highly discourage, the fund wouldn't run out of money, because there's still money coming in as money goes out. It's just trending downward, and the liability is growing. And so it's the longer you wait, the harder the fix is.
But is that an honest way to frame it? Over the course of the next 30 years, if you want to project out what we need for road repair budgets, maybe we're going to be short in the following years because we don't know. We don't know how much we're going to have to take in. I don't understand why it's being why the 1.9 billion is being framed as a frankly big scary number that sounds like it needs to be solved when it's being projected out to 30 years. And maybe it's unfair to ask you because I think maybe the governor is setting that agenda point. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I just think that number is designed to reflect the difference between what we owe and what we have to pay. And so, you're definitely right in that it's not like something that's going to come due tomorrow, but it is something that I think reflects where the funding status is. And if we want to be responsible, we at least need to put the funding path back on a trajectory to meet that obligation.
I think too, when you're dealing with something that's on a long timeline, you're talking about retirees for public workers. So you're talking about careers that last 20, 25, 30 years, from when they go from being someone who pays into the pension to somebody who's collecting from the pension. I think part of what frustrates me as we talk about these issues is I think because the numbers are big, I think we sort of get a blindness when we start talking about billions of dollars. It's hard to wrap your mind around that. But also the timelines are so long. Because Ben's right. It's not an immediate threat, but it is a threat down the road. And I think sometimes that could create a moral hazard where we kick the can down the road and we make politically expedient decisions now as opposed to doing the hard work of making sure that this is going to be solvent into the future. That's my take on it.
Yeah, there is a point to that, and I would say that the politically expedient thing would be to do nothing. To your kind of joke at the beginning, pensions aren't the most exciting topic. It would be easier to spend the money on something else, something that's more interesting to voters. But it's a long-term the problem that we need to address, and so. I am grateful that even with folks that I'm not 100% in agreement with on the method to get there, that there is recognition that it is a good time to ask.
And let's start there, because I think so far we've been talking about the thing that just about everybody agrees with is we got to do something to change the trajectory on the, because that's all you're ever talking about when you're talking about pensions. You want to change the trajectory, right? You want the lines going up, not down. So everybody agrees on that. Where you differ is you don't want to move away from a defined benefit plan. Why?
There's a few reasons for that. The costs associated with closing the plan, you run into extra costs as far as paying down that liability to close it entirely. It's not as simple as paying off the liability. There's issues we run into with making sure the money is all there to pay the benefits out, to make sure we're not taking on more risk than the state should be when we owe that money to people who have earned it. And then there's also, I guess that goes hand in hand with cash flow issues. The retirement plan has to be in a situation where it can have the cash to pay that out when people deserve it. And so from my perspective, my goals with this legislation are to make sure, one, that we're doing this in a way that's responsible with taxpayer dollars, because I wouldn't want to pay more money just to close the plan. And so I want to make sure we're being responsible with taxpayer dollars. And frankly, I do think the defined benefit plan provides a competitive benefit for state employees. And so under my plan, I think we'd be doing a more responsible action with taxpayer dollars and then maintaining that benefit that is competitive and desired by a lot of state employees, both past and present and potentially future.
Senator Cleary, when it comes to either surrounding states or nationally, have you gotten any, I'm going to use some acronyms that are very legislatively acronyms now, gotten any kind of CSG, NCSL style data on how many states still have a defined benefit pension plan for their public employees versus not right now?
It's a very high percentage. There are a few that have hybrid plans where the portion of their benefit comes from a defined benefit and some from their kind of defined contribution savings. That's one thing that makes this difficult is there is a very small sample size of states that have successfully transitioned from a defined benefit to a defined contribution. You could count them on one hand, and the problems associated with that when folks look at the cost and then the impact it has on the ability to recruit and retain workers, I think it's a lot more difficult than a lot of folks would think.
I'm an advocate. I would like to see us move away from the defined benefit plan. I think there's a reason why the private sector has moved away from it. And the reason why the public sector hasn't is because, frankly, it's politically fraught and politicians have to get elected, and it's expensive. And I think it's a lot easier. But my worry, Sean, is that if we don't move away from a defined benefit plan, then our only options in the future, because these plans are fundamentally flawed. They're depending on people who are in the plan paying into it so that it can afford to pay out to retirees, right? So you have to have the people who are currently working paying in to pay out to the retirees, plus you have some interest earnings from the way the pension is invested. I think they're fundamentally fraud because we're guaranteeing a set payout based on revenues that are not guaranteed. And so I worry that the only way to fix them in the long run, if we don't transition away, and I agree with you, the cost of doing that. I mean, because think about it. If you start moving new hires out of the system, then we have to replace what they would be paying into the pension to pay out the benefits to the retirees. We have to replace that with revenue, appropriations from the taxpayer. So I get it. It's a headache. It's hugely expensive. But if we leave it in place, then the only way to address these shortfalls is either we keep cutting what the pension pays out in benefits, or we keep putting in more from the taxpayers and the employees. I worry that just fixing it, when I brought up political expediency earlier, I understand the argument you're making. I'd rather do the hard work on this now, when North Dakota's in a position of strength financially. They keep kicking the can down the road.
Well, Rob, a couple of thoughts on that. From my perspective, it's actually more difficult to close the plan when we have such a large liability because we have to pay that money out that's owed to folks. It would be another thing if the plan was already 100% funded because the money would be there to pay the benefits out over the course of the lifetime of the plan. But you hit the nail on the head when you talked about there's going to be people who keep having the benefit, but not new folks coming into it. And so we're going to have to make sure we keep paying that money out.
That's reality.
Yeah. And, I would say one of the advantages that the government has over private sector organizations in this fashion is we have the ability to hold this money in funds that we can use to pay it off. A lot of businesses, that's just not financially feasible to have those sorts of funds available to find a pension like this. And, from my perspective, the state of North Dakota is not going anywhere. We can't think in a short-term way. If we have to solve this problem over the next 30 years, I'm perfectly fine doing that.
And Senator Cleary, I mean, just from a philosophical perspective, I gotta put in a little bit. Cranky old liberal has to, play his part here, too, because at the end of the day, the public sector employees, it's not as if they're freeloading or spending money. These are all pensions that are paid into on some level and earned over the course, and the amount of pension they receive is equivalent to the amount of time they have been working in the public sector. I understand that public sector pensions, as to Rob's point, have tended to stay on the defined benefit side and are thus a little bit, on the whole, more lucrative than the private sector side. But there's an immediate comparison or immediate factor there that the private sector simply offers more lucrative paychecks for comparative work in most industries, not in every single industry one by one. And if you're just starting in the private sector versus 30 years in the public sector, you can cherry pick examples, but overall, you can simply make more money, if not double or triple the money over the course of a career working in corporate America, especially on the white collar side, frankly, than you can in the public sector. And at some point, you need to have some kind of advantage to attract work talent there. And additionally, these pensions we pay out, I understand these are government funds, probably subsidized by a taxpayer, including my taxpayer dollars, to those public sector employees. But if you want your streets plowed, if you want sidewalks, if you want public works, if you want to function in society, ain't none of it free. It's like national security.
I want to jump in. I want to jump in and say, I mean, essentially, that's another cost if you think about it. If we take away the defined benefit pension, you're probably going to have to increase salaries to make those positions lucrative because you're shrinking a part of that compensation pie for new hires. And so that's a fair point.
And for generation of economic activity, when those pensions are paid out to public sector employees, again, not to condescend to them, I'm sorry, folks who have been plowing the street or working on working for a city, municipal, or state side tend not to be millionaires. When they get those pensions are what they're using to pay their rent, their mortgage, to live. That money goes back into the economy. I understand that there's a whole lot of philosophy around government stimulus, what have you, but those goes into products and services that people need to live. They don't just get shorn up. I understand it's not a government program to do that, but it's not as if these dollars stay stagnant. They stay with public employees who tend to stay in the state of North Dakota, especially if they put down family roots here, having had a long-term career in the private sector. Now, unfortunately, I turned to a commentator, not an interviewer. So,
I think we both did that. I think we both did that. Yeah.
Well, you did touch on, one of the arguments that is, in my opinion, a strong one for the defined benefit pension, and that it does provide strong retirement security or financially once folks are done working here. And it is possible to do that through a defined contribution plan too. I'm on a defined contribution plan, and I'm hoping to retire at some point. But as far as bang for our buck for the taxpayers, the defined benefit pension plan is able to provide a much more generous pension for the dollar amounts that go into it. And so when we talk about the trade-offs between keeping it open and keeping it, or deciding to transition away from it, when I looked at those numbers, I really had concerns about the amount of tax dollars that would go to closing a plan that provides a lot of benefit to our state employees.
Senator Cleary, an actual procedure question for you. You have a bill is sponsored, right? You have a bill sponsored right now. Has that had a hearing yet?
We're having a hearing on Friday for it.
Got it.
And I guess that to note that, there are competing proposals, and I have been having conversations with those folks, because I think we have similar goals. We all are trying to do a fiscally responsible thing. We're all trying to keep the promise we've made to state employees, and we're trying to offer a competitive retirement benefit for future state employees. The path to that varies pretty broadly based on the goal, but it is a conversation that, I have been engaging with folks who don't always agree with me on it, and we're going to continue to do that throughout session.
Do you feel like, I know sometimes we hear, are there other things we can do in terms of shoring it up? And I don't know that this is true in North Dakota. Sometimes we hear, public workers in other places, maybe a police officer, they'll work for one department and they'll get in the pension there, and then they go to work for another department and they so they're double dipping on their pensions or collecting 2 or 3. Do we have any of that kind of thing going on in North Dakota? Is that a vein that we could mine for a way to try to make this fund more solvent?
They do. We have done that in the past, where we increase the age that you hit a certain rule to be able to retire. And, like I mentioned earlier, we have cut the benefits that are paid through the defined benefit pension. One of the criticisms of our plan is, compared to a lot of other states, it's not as generous. And I would still argue that it's more generous than it would be under a defined contribution plan. But compared to some other states, our multiplier for the amount you get in benefit is relatively low. So I think we've asked a lot from our state employees as far as asking them to contribute more and receive less. And so I think it's incumbent upon the state to step up and provide its side of the bargain to move forward on that.
And I should point out, coming from a Bismarck area legislative district, and I don't mean this pejoratively, you represent a lot of public employees, and obviously this is in their interest. So, I understand that that's a lot of the perspective you're speaking from as well.
I do represent a lot of public sector employees, and it was really great talking with a lot of them as I was campaigning, I guess, twice this year. But, I think I would feel this way regardless of what district I was representing. When I look at the tax dollars involved, we all represent taxpayers regardless of what district they live in. And so when we look to do the fiscally responsible thing, yeah, sure, District 35 is unique with the amount of state employees here, but I do think that this is the right thing to do for taxpayers in the state as a whole.
Well, it's going to be an interesting debate for sure. I'm not, and again, because we're dealing with such big numbers on such long timelines. I think sometimes it's hard to define what fiscally responsible means, because to me, continuing to continuing to use a pension system that requires bailouts. I mean, even if we shore it up and we don't have to think about it again for 5 years, 10 years, inevitably we're going to have to do something, whether it's cut benefits again or put more money into it again. I just like to stop it. We shouldn't have started it. And now that it's going, it's going to cost so much to get out of it. I just don't know that that's a good argument for maintaining the status quo, that it's going to be really hard and really expensive to get out of it. I'd like to get out of it so it doesn't continue to be a problem.
And one thing to note on that, Rob, is both the bills to, in my case, keep the plan open and to close it use a acronym ADEC. It's actuarialized determined employer contributions, which is a fancy way of saying state contributions over the lifetime of the bill in order to hit the target. So in my case, I want to have it 100% funded in the next 30 years. And so those contributions are mathematically determined to meet that goal. So it's not like we're just kind of guessing that we're going to have it funded. People who are much smarter than me under both proposals calculate those contributions that are required from the state. And sure, you and I can disagree on, is this a public policy decision to offer this? I would argue yes, but it is, we are doing this in a way that begins with the end in mind, and in my case, that's fully funding the pension liability.
I'm sorry. I wanted to ask you too about Representative Casper's bill. He put it in. He would like to loop, because part of this is we have political subdivisions, so like cities, and they're part of the state pension plan. And I think some of the proposals sort of hold. When I talked to Representative Casper about it, Representative Jim Casper, Republican from Fargo, he told me he felt like the political subdivisions were getting a pass, and that it's their workers too, so they should pay their fair share. I don't know how I feel about that, because I am both a taxpayer in the city of Minot and a taxpayer for the state of North Dakota. So it's like you're telling me you're going to take it out of my right pocket instead of my left pocket. I don't know, but what do you think of his bill?
Well, his bill also seeks to close the defined benefit pension plan. So kind of off the cuff, it's fundamentally different than mine. But I do think it's a conversation worth having to talk about how this impacts political subdivisions, because I think there is a certain point to that they owe a portion of their plan. Their employees are on the plan and receive that benefit. And so to the extent that they have to fund it, I think that'll be something we discuss throughout the session. But I do think it's a conversation worth having. They are folks who are benefiting from the plan. So asking them to pay a portion of the cost, I think, is a reasonable thing too.
Senator Cleary, and it might not be fair to ask you this for everyone, but what have you done, and do you know of the other bill sponsors, the governor's office, to involve and bring public employees to the table at this debate? Because what I don't want to do, and what I don't think you want to do either, to be clear, is be talking about public employees as if there's some sort of other entity that we can't speak to. I mean, these are our next door neighbors. I don't happen to be a public sector employee, but there's plenty of them around, and I'm sure they are, we might consider the accounting side of this to be a little bit boring, but it's very interesting for people whose retirement are depending on this. So what's being done to bring their voices to the table?
To be clear, I'm married to one, albeit one who is a teacher, so this debate isn't directly. But I mean, I one thing I do like is everybody involved in this debate. I don't think anybody is talking about denying people who are vested in the pension. Everybody is saying, no, if you're vested in the pension, we got to meet that obligation. Nobody's saying that.
Yeah, that's correct, Rob. And to your point, Ben, I have been talking with the public employees. I walked down the hall and their constituents, a lot of them. So I have been getting that perspective as well. I would say that, the goal of this, is to get the data that we have available to make the best decision we can, and then move forward there. If we go through this whole process and it looks like, there's a better way to do this and that provides a better benefit and is cheaper to taxpayers, I'm open to hearing about it. But from the numbers I've seen so far, I think my plan provides a good way to do that.
Well, Senator Cleary, I think we've used up all our time with you, and I know you guys are busy down there. I'm sure as heck busy writing about all the stuff you guys are doing. So
we don't let you go. You won't be able to have lunch before that floor session. That's crucial. I've been there.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. And are you allowed to eat on the floor? Can you bring a sandwich into your desk?
Technically, but it kind of don't want to make a mess of the workstation.
I was quietly told
you don't want to be
Carlson, you're not supposed to, and I don't think he was wrong about that.
Nobody wants to get caught in the background while someone's delivering an impassioned speech, mowing down on a ham sandwich or something. So, Senator Cleary, we'll let you go.
Well, thanks for your time, Ben and Rob, and thanks for all you guys are doing, and I'll talk to you soon.
Hi, everybody. I'm Chad Kuhl, host of the Northland Outdoors podcast. Hey, here in the Northland, we love our time outside. And on the Northland Outdoors podcast, we're going to talk about all of it. Not just fishing, not just hunting, but mountain biking, camping, rock climbing, bird watching, you name it. We're going to have it on the Northland Outdoors podcast. New episodes every 2 weeks on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. So look for it and join us on the Northland Outdoors podcast.
All right, just finished up with Senator Sean Cleary. A very good discussion about pensions, which I think is a necessary discussion. And again, I mean, one thing that's gratifying, because I know this in years past, these debates over the pensions have been a little bruising. I really like that nobody wants to pull the rug out from under public workers. I certainly don't. To the extent that anybody's talking about, reforming it, we're talking about doing that for new hires, so that when people who are coming into state employment, they're getting a different deal. Yeah. I mean, they're coming in with their eyes open. They aren't coming in on one, I'm going to get a pension, and then all of a sudden we're saying, oh, no, you're not. Nobody wants to do that. But
that has happened in the past in other sectors, both private and public, and I am glad there's consensus around that. I'm sorry to cut you off there, but I actually don't know if I agree with you that the pension discussion has been bruising in the past few years. Intense for sure, with much disagreement, but I don't think it's gotten personal, and I don't think it's gotten salacious. I think it's been much talked about, but it should be. That's the state government.
You got to remember, I do politics on the internet for a living, so. Sometimes I see things through that lens, so I'm heartened to hear that from your perspective it hasn't been. I think sometimes there is a tendency to paint people who want to do pension reform as being callous towards public workers, and maybe there's some that are. I think that's the rule. I think
there are cases where that is the case. I think the Bush era policy about the post office is absolutely cynical, and I think it's a terrible policy we should have gotten rid of a long time ago. That is not what we were talking about with Senator Cleary, to be fair, but as an example of a public sector being put under unfair scrutiny versus other similar government departments, and therefore kind of crushing the service and not making it so a lot of people want to sign up to work there.
Yeah.
And that is the kind of thing that can happen if you don't do it correctly.
I think it's just hard sometimes, because there's Working in state government is a lot different than working in the private sector. And listen, both of my parents were public. My father was a cop. My mom was a city clerk. My wife is a teacher, right? So I am certainly sympathetic to public workers. And I'm biased. My dad works for the USDA, so right. I've worked my entire life in the private sector, and for chunks of it was self-employed. And I mean, there are times when I hear public workers talk about their situations, and I think, boy, I wish I had the problems you had. Because I mean, some of the benefits and the days off and everything, it's really, now, to be fair, that also means that they accept a lower salary a lot of the times than maybe what they could command in the private sector. But I don't know. I think sometimes we get carried away talking about to a sector, though. It is lower compensation, and you do say that there are more. There's federal holidays recognized. There's certain guaranteed time off, but for some, especially city workers and emergency workers, there's no days off when there's a blizzard. There's no days off when there's an emergency. Cops have to work holidays. Cops have to work nights and weekends, and I get that. Ain't no Thanksgiving off. I mean, there is Thanksgiving off for cops, but then Christmas isn't off, or vice versa. My dad was a cop. I am well aware of the schedule. For me, I would be fine preserving some kind of a defined benefit as long as it could be sustained. And I question, and I think this is and I brought this up with Senator Cleary, and it's mildly unfair, but it's not, because he's a state senator. The way we frame government budgets is important, because if you take one number and isolate it by itself, which frankly I feel the governor has, $1.9 billion. Isn't that a scary big number? Yes, it is. In comparison to what? What are the, this is over the course of
Senator Cleary was saying about 30 years. Do you think I got that right? Because it's not tomorrow we're short. It's not the next year.
I mean, because
what
they're doing is a projection.
Decades?
What they're doing is a projection, and they're saying over the next 30 years, we are going to owe 1.9 billion more we are obligated to 1.9 billion more in payments to pension to retirees, people collecting the pension that were projected to take in revenues from investments and from workers who are still working. It's important to talk about that.
Makes sense.
And it has to be a prediction because some of those workers are never going to collect their pensions. They're unfortunate. They're going to die.
Now that's probably factored into the projection.
Sure, I mean, but I mean,
smart people making those factor that.
All of it's an estimate. All of it's an actuarial table, right? I mean, it's just that's what they're doing. But it's the best guess we have, and I think it's important. I think the opposite of you that saying, we get it's a big scary number. Yeah, but maybe we do need to be scared a little bit because otherwise we say, it's 30 years and we don't need to do anything. It's 30 years down the road. Who cares? I don't want to wait. I don't want to wait till there's a crisis.
I think that perspective is valid. I think taken all the way, you could apply it to things like the governor's flat tax plan. Say, absolutely not. We can't afford to cut $500 million worth of revenue. We can't afford that. Look at how much more we're paying out right now. We're paying out 40% more than we're taking in.
Except the impact of that is immediate, not 30 years down the road. I mean, if we cut the income tax, I don't know when the effective date is on his bill, but it's going to be. It ain't 30 years from now.
Year.
It's not 30 years from now. It's next year or the year after. I don't know when they phase that in if it passes. But anyway, that's that. And again, I think that's one of the reasons why it's hard to debate it because it's a moral. I always think it creates a moral hazard because anytime you give politicians the opportunity to do something easy versus doing something hard. A lot of times they'll choose to do the easy and politically expedient things. And with pensions, a lot of times that's just go along to get along.
Yeah. And so right now, there are two competing proposals. It's the governor's proposal, which is now, how is that? Now the governor can't write a bill.
It's House Majority Leader Mike LaFleur has that bill.
Mike LaFleur of the House has that bill, and that is directly in line with the governor's thoughts.
That is, I think, the governor's proposal, but introduced by
So let's describe to folks then how this happens, and I'll take a thwack at it. So Representative LaFleur is the majority leader in the House. He's the leader of a very large Republican majority. I don't know what it is, 80% of the House now, 85? I don't know.
There's I don't know what the percentage is. There's 14 Democratic House members at this point.
It's likely to pass in the House. I do not know what the numbers are going to be like for Senator Cleary's alternative proposal that's also coming from a Republican and in the Bismarck area, as you've said, who does represent a lot of public employees. If they passed both of their respective chambers, I think there's a decent chance they would. They are going to go to crossover where they will be met in each other's chamber and heard in the other chamber. Now, it's basic civics. What I think is going to be really, really interesting is if the House either kills Senator Cleary's bill once it moves over to the House because it didn't originate in that chamber, or if vice versa happens and they have to be in some version of this bill has to be resurrected in not crossover. What's the conference committee between the two chambers. I could see a very important pension plan coming down to 3 senators and 3 representatives in the last week, and I'm going to be very interested to see how heavy a hand the governor's office takes in interacting with them. And there's only so heavy a hand the governor can play too. That's not a commentary on him one way or another. I want people to know how it works. A lot of people's pensions are going to be impacted by this.
As Senator Cleary referred to, this isn't our first rodeo with pension reform. And I suspect what's going to happen is Senator Cleary's bill is going to look very palatable because we're not debating this issue in a vacuum. This is a legislative session where a lot of people are coming with a lot of wants, including income tax cuts, including earlier in the episode interviewing the Attorney General. He wants a 24% increase in $24 million increase in his office's budget. He wants, there are lawmakers that want mandatory minimum sentences, and that has an impact on. So we're not. I think that's where pension reform becomes so difficult. Is it's very easy to say, okay, let's just make the appropriation. Let's not gird our loins for a very long-term commitment of having to appropriate the dollars to replace what would have been paid in by new enrollees to the plan. That then has to shift over to the taxpayers. I think it's very easy to say, we'll put some money in now, we'll push the timeline later, and we'll leave it at that. I think that's been the appetite. That's what the legislature's done in the past. I fully expect them to do it again. And I think even the governor, even his appetite, what do you think the governor wants more? To get rid of the defined benefit pension plan, the problems with which, if we ever reach, are going to be well after he's left office, or his income tax reform? If he had to choose between the two, which one do you think he'd want?
I think he'll try and say both, if I had to guess, but
that's what he would say.
Income tax.
That's what he would say. I think he would choose the income tax, because what's easier when he campaigns in 2024, what's the better thing to campaign on?
Oh yeah, I cut your income tax, baby. I didn't cut your pension.
So that's,
and if he does change it to a defined contribution, I could actually see that being something for a Democratic opponent to make hay out of. Is that going to change the tide?
That's a harder argument to make.
Another issue to bring up.
It's the right argument to make, but people could bash him and say, look at all this money we're obligated to now to phase out this defined benefit plan that, was never, if there were any problems with it, we're going to be 30 years in the future. But now he created all this problem now. That's a tough political argument to make. I think it's the right argument, but it's a tough one to make.
Senator Cleary didn't have an answer for me off the top of his head. I think I want to look into it. I think it's well worth bringing up when we're talking about this. North Dakota's roughly where we had 740,000 people, maybe we're more now, but either way, I'd like to know what's the rough number of workers in the public sector, because I think we have a little bit of a larger public sector percentage-wise than most states, and that's not something special to us. That tends to happen in rural states.
We're spread out. We're spread out, right?
And we're spread out. And I'd like to know how many long-term job openings we have in the public sector that we are trying to fill right now. And long-term is an extremely subjective term. I understand that, but if it's been open for like more than a year, because we have a lot of those in the private sector right now. In my area where we're at, we have 4,000 private sector jobs that pay more than $70,000 a year, and they've been open for more than a year. How many of that statewide is happening in the public sector? How is this going to impact that?
I think one reputation that I've earned when I talk about policy, like I don't shy away from things that are inconvenient to my argument. And one thing that is inconvenient to the argument for pension reform is the fact that getting rid of a defined benefit pension makes public service less attractive to workers who are going to then say, no, if you're not going to give me a defined benefit pension, and people make decisions for lots of different reasons, but there are many
factors, but it makes it hard for a manager who looks at someone who's talented, who's got some ambition, who is like, are they going to stay in this job
right now,
a year, then move to the private sector for a more lucrative paycheck?
Right now, they could say, well, you might make a little less per year, but you've got this very lucrative, retirement pension that's certainly more lucrative than what you're likely to get in the private sector. So that evens things out. You take that away, that changes that equation, and that probably means that salaries are going to have to go up to create equilibrium and keep attracting public workers. That has a cost too, and that's something that the pension reformers like myself, that's something that we have to stare in the face. And now I still make the argument for doing it. Anyway, we've talked that issue to death. What else do we want to? Representative Ben, I had a column about this. Representative Ben Koppelman, he's a West Fargo guy. He wants to get rid of approval voting in Fargo. And although his bill
technically statewide,
right? Well, technically statewide, but Fargo's the only place doing it. He wants to get rid of approval voting, but then also ranked choice voting. Now, nobody in North Dakota is doing ranked choice. That's distinct. And for people who don't know, ranked choice is I know it made some national headlines. I think a special election for Congress in Alaska, they used ranked choice. And essentially that's where you rank the candidates. This is my number 1 candidate, my number 2 candidate, my number 3 candidate. Yeah. It's also sometimes referred to as the instant runoff. So what happens is if nobody gets 50% when all the first choice votes are counted, what happens is the bottom vote getter is kicked off. And then the second choice of everybody who voted for that last vote getter, their second choice votes are counted. And then they keep doing that, going down to third choice, fourth choice, until somebody has over 50%. Instant runoff is what that's called. Approval voting is you basically just vote for everybody you approve of, and then all the votes are counted, and whoever gets the most votes wins.
And it kind of becomes, who do you disapprove of? Because then you're not filling in the box of someone you don't really want. And people can have arguments back and forth about the effectiveness, the philosophy, etc. But I've got a real problem with Representative Koppelman's bill in that this went to a citywide vote, City of Fargo. City of Fargo, by a decent margin, voted in favor of approval voting and is now the system. The people, the voters of Fargo, to right now, right this very moment, have the ability to go gather signatures, put this back on the citywide ballot, and repeal it and turn it back to exactly what it was. That's home rule charter. That's local control. And right now, in this country, we do not have a federally mandated way we run elections. So if you live here, you can win off of plurality when you win statewide. If you live in Georgia or Louisiana, you can't. And that's why Raphael Warnock had to run twice, and his opponent, his Republican opponent,
that's why it seems seemingly in Georgia. I think Louisiana has the same. You hear
Louisiana
a lot
has
of
the same, and you have to get more than 50%. Each state has a different way of running it.
The argument,
so you cannot tell me if a state can run their own that somehow you know better than a home rule charter and what the voters say. I think that's being superior. I think it's arrogance.
I have almost zero sympathy for the city of Fargo that often likes to flout state laws, that often seems to think there's some sort of a Vatican City from the rest of the state, whether we're talking about traffic fines that they had to be smacked down by the state Supreme Court. I mean, there's all sorts of ways. I don't give a rip if Fargo thinks it's arrogant or not. My argument as a citizen of North Dakota is how we elect our people within North Dakota should be uniform. I don't think it should change. We talk all the time. Like every time we talk about, well, you've got to bring, you got to bring an ID to the law, and people go feigning into the bushes because it's so complicated to get a voter ID. It's so hard, all these voting. It's going to confuse people, whatever. But for some reason, creating a dramatically different sort of voting for local elections in Fargo than is for every other election in the state, that's not confusing to people.
It could be confusing. The people have the choice to vote on it. Full disclosure, I didn't.
They do, and I
would absolutely defend their right to vote for it and choose.
I don't care
how they are governed. That's home rule charter.
I don't care about home rule charter.
Even has a legal basis for doing it.
Of course he does. Fargo's a political subdivision of the state. It's not some sovereign entity of itself. The state can impose
but it
laws.
has a home rule charter that allows it to make those rules.
I don't care. I would get rid of the home rule charter policy, frankly. Which is how I feel about local. As you can tell, my frustration level with local officials who like to have all the power and none of the responsibility is extremely high. Although your position on this is unique. You ran in an election with approval voting, right? Or am I getting? No, you ran for Cass County Commission.
No, I didn't, because I ran for the county commission. So that was still 50%.
You're right.
Whoever's the highest vote getter wins. But I understand why.
Cass County, Fargo, same thing.
To your point, it's confusing because in Fargo it only applies to mayor, city commission, and I can't remember if it applies to the park board or not because that's a city entity, but it does not apply to the school district because those are separate, and it does not apply to the county because that's a county and not the city. But I think that democracy is messy, and you have a right to be messy, and if you don't like it, you have a right to go out and work against it. But
sure.
I feel like what he's doing is working the refs instead of going out in the field and playing the best game possible. Go out and organize people to take this out on the city ballot and convince people instead of doing it from on high in Bismarck.
I think some things, and it really bothered me, like when we were debating like smoking bans, right? Where we're gonna I remember, and we ultimately ended up this became a moot point. But like the city of Devil's Lake was considering going to an age 21 tobacco law. And I think that creates big problems because if you're 20 and you buy a pack of cigarettes in Minot and then drive down Highway 2 to Grand Forks, it's illegal for the 5 minutes that you're driving through Grand Forks for you to have that pack of cigarettes. I think that's very problematic. I don't like the idea of sort of patchwork
but that's what you're holding in your car, not how you're voting. There's no, I don't know, you go to the ballot box, you go to the ballot box. Unlike your argument makes sense because it's that inconsistent while you're driving, that doesn't work. But you vote where you live. And so if you're voting in West Fargo, you don't vote with Frank
I look at all the problems we have with turnout now. And I look at all the complaining we hear of every year about people. I mean, even though it frustrates me, the number of voters who just tune in and they didn't know that they had to have their address updated on their driver's license. This stuff is not rocket science, but for some reason it still confuses the hell out of people. So I don't understand why suddenly a lot of the same people who have a problem with voter IDs can't understand that this might be confusing to people and this might deter people from voting. I think if we're going to have elections in North Dakota, we need to, and listen, there was going to be a ballot measure a couple cycles. Now it ended up being kept off the ballot by the courts, but there was a ballot that would have, I think theirs was ranked choice, would have imposed ranked choice on the state.
Was that last year?
That was, no, I think it was the year before.
2 cycles ago? Okay.
Yeah, I think that's right. But it was, I just think that if we're going to have elections in North Dakota, we ought to do them the same way. Either we've got what we have now, it's called first past the post or plurality voting. You know, if we want to go to something, and really, I mean, if you're bothered by the idea that people are winning that didn't necessarily get a 50+1 majority of the vote,
which I'm not, by the way.
I'm not particularly bothered by that, but if people are, then okay, let's have runoff systems like they do in Georgia. I don't really have a problem with what Georgia does because Georgia takes the top 2 finalists, whatever they're.
I actually do. I think Georgia's a waste of time and money because guess what? Both times Raphael Warnock got a hair more than his Republican opponent and the third-party person, and then they did a runoff, and he got a hair more than the Republican opponent, and we all spent millions of dollars on this. Why? What's the point?
Right. I'm not bothered by plurality voting. It doesn't bother me. I think it's fine. I don't know really what problem we're solving with approval voting, but that is another argument, and I made this in my column. I worry too. I am very keen on the idea that the mandate to govern comes from the people, right? And so we need to make sure that the mandate that comes from voters is clear. But with approval voting, I don't know that it's clear at all because you're allowing voters to dilute their votes by voting for other people. There is absolutely.
Except for they can choose to only vote for one person. They can choose.
They can. But I mean, there's risks. I mean, what's the risk in that? The dynamic in that? I mean,
hey, it's the old. I think it's Winston Churchill. It's the old like democracy is the worst system except for all the other ones. You unfortunately have to trust those people to vote. And I understand your frustrations with it. I do want to dispel one thing, which is there tends to be this argument around this, and I wonder if I haven't had a chance to ask him, but I wonder if Representative Koppelman thinks this of approval voting. It's a big, it tends to be associated with lefties and lefty activists, and this is a big scheme.
It was literally socialists who pushed it in Fargo.
Well, guess what? The result of the election was Commissioner Dave Pepcorn getting reelected by a pretty resounding number, and Denise Kolpak, who I'd say within the Fargo range of politics is pretty much in the middle. You might say she leans on the left side. You might not on some issues, but there were several people to the left of her that ran who did not win. There were several people to the right, to around the same area of the right as Dave Pepcorn. Guess what? Dave Pepcorn, the incumbent, won, and Denise Kolpak, who's been known around the community, won. So it was kind of a normal seeming election.
I don't think we should. I don't accept any argument against a voting scheme that is organized around certain people are going to win and certain people are going to lose. Like, if that's your argument, that's not why we should design a voting system to help liberals win or to help Republicans win. I don't think it's accurate when people say approval voting necessarily. I think a lot of times that's going to depend on the dynamic. I mean, one problem in Fargo, for a long time, back when it was plurality voting, I think the reason a lot of people perceived conservative leaning, again, we're talking about nonpartisan races, but candidates who were perceived as being more conservative, one reason why they were winning is because so many Fargo liberals would run against each other for open city commission seats.
And they would pull any kind of organized political party.
Right.
We're Democrats.
So they would pull votes away from one another. And so in Fargo,
and sometimes conservatives would do that too. They'd split the vote too. I mean, the big standout, frankly, in Fargo was Tony Garrick, and Tony Garrick stood out because he threw some elbows and he stuck to a very singular issue campaign that was easy to remember. Vote for me and there won't be any more property taxes. None of it was true. Property taxes didn't go down, but that's what he said. And he voted that way when he was on the commission too. But it was a single issue campaign.
The economic development.
And he was against economic development subsidies. And if you didn't like those, vote for him because that's what he voted for. But I don't know that approval voting takes that. I don't think approval voting would take away a person's ability to run a Tony Garrick style campaign. Right, and really,
it's just those nonpartisan races too where I think it's a factor. Because most races where you're pitting. Like for a statewide office for governor, it's just about always a Democrat versus a Republican. Maybe you have an independent. I don't know that approval voting is going to help an independent candidate in a statewide race like that. I think now maybe like House district races for the legislature where you have usually 4 candidates running for 2 spots. But even then, I just don't think it's going to change.
I even disagree there, though,
because
we've never had an independent even come close to even getting in the legislature, have we?
No,
Not
but
in my time.
Yeah, but I'm saying if you have a dynamic where maybe somebody likes a Democrat and a Republican, as you know what I'm saying. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, but I think there's so much scheming around it, and I don't know where the urgency is.
What I hear is
to stop doing something they've already agreed to, that the majority of the people who voted have already voted on, and have the ability to repeal on their own. I don't know.
What I hear us both saying is that approval voting doesn't change much, but it does create some. So why do it? I guess that's my argument. Why do it? And again, the thing I don't like, and I wrote about this in the column, I don't like that Representative Koppelman's bill bans 2 specific types of voting schemes. If I had written the bill, it would have had the same effect with regard to Fargo. If I had written the bill, I would have said all political subdivisions must use the plurality. I don't know how you'd word it, but basically would
legislative
require
council would word it for you, as they did for Ben Koppelman.
Everybody has to use the plurality system. Like nobody could go off and use a different system. Every election that's held in North Dakota has to use the first past the post system. And if we want to change that, then it has to change for everybody. That's what I would prefer. Elections in North Dakota should run the same way, and it shouldn't matter if you live in Fargo or West Fargo.
And I don't remember, actually, I studied this once upon a time, but as far as, cities can have commissions or they can have councils and they can be organized or incorporated, I don't think that's forced to be uniform across the state. I think the cities can come up with that on their own charter too, right?
Yeah, well, we change like
and wards. Cities can do wards or they can't.
Right, Minot changed not that long ago where we had,
and they should be able to.
We cut the number of officials down that were on. I think we had 15, and it was a ward system.
14 or
50. We had a lot. I
14
can't
a mayor,
remember now.
And then you cut it down to 7. It makes sense, but the city should be allowed to do that. Fargo doesn't have wards. I'd argue that it might be a little bit better if it had a better system. It had districts, but I think the city of Fargo should be allowed to decide that. And so I think this is the same extension. I don't know. I think it's an overreach.
I think it's good. Because even if you change the structure, the number of people who are on a city commission have wards, don't have wards, going to the ballot box and voting should work the same way no matter where you're at in North Dakota. And if we want to change the way that works, change it for everybody. That's what I think. We got a few minutes left. Anything else, Ben, that's on your radar?
Nothing that's popped up real hot. I mean, there's all kinds of social issues, hot button issues. So I
will preview a column that I'm gonna write. I'm gonna write a little bit about where I think a lot of the social issue stuff comes from. I think it's always fashionable to say, "Oh, look at all these idiots," depending on, of course, how you feel about those bills and which bill we're talking about. I don't disagree with all of them, but I think a lot of this intense focus on what I would describe as the culture war is not, I don't think it's a top-down thing coming from the lawmakers. I think it's very much a bottom-up thing. I look at, especially the Republican primaries last year, a lot of this it's the will of the people. I mean, voters wanted this. And I'm going to write about it in the context of the primary in District 33, which I think is a very clear-cut example where you had an experienced lawmaker, Senator Jessica Bell, who was involved in frankly saving instrumental about as anybody in the legislature in saving Coal Creek Station, saving a lot of jobs, lost in the primary because she voted to sustain the Governor Burgum's veto of a transgender sports participation bill last session. So I think if you look at something like that, a lot of these people in Bismarck were elected to pursue exactly what they're pursuing. Now, that doesn't make it right. It doesn't mean you have to agree with it or you have to like it. It's not an exoneration of what they're pursuing. But I think it's important because sometimes we kind of let voters off the hook, right? Nobody wants to talk about when lawmakers are doing stupid things that they really are doing what their constituents wanted them to do.
No, I don't think voters can be left off the hook. But right now with the partisan situation in the state, you've written about this, and I feel you're correct in that a lot of times the real election kind of started with Governor Burgum before he was governor. The real election in the state is starting to be the primary, the Republican primary. And there, the squeakiest wheels are getting the oil. And I wonder if those squeakiest wheels aren't fully representative of the electorate as a whole.
Well, I don't think they are.
When those legislators are going to Bismarck. And I obviously I'm not on that side of the aisle, but I do think I've grown up here my whole life, and I feel like there's a pretty broad consensus around keeping out of people's personal lives as far as the government goes. And there's definitely people who are exceptions to that, but I feel like they're grabbing headlines out of proportion. But I think they may be writing legislation out of proportion to what the desire is as well. I understand where you're coming from, but I wonder if they're truly representing the majority of the priorities here. And what bothers me is we only have one bill when we were talking to Commissioner Gottfried, but we only have one bill talking about a alternative to how we're doing prescription drug pricing, for instance, instead of competing bills. Now we have two competing bills about pensions. We've got a bill from Representative Thomas about our corporate farming law. One bill. These are from serious-minded lawmakers who are having debates about things that directly impact things to the state ministers. We have, 12, 13 bills about transgender persons in the state. We have how many abortion bills? We have how many? It's just all these hot-button personal life intrusive bills that I don't know if anyone was waking up in the morning going, boy, I really hope the state gets involved in this decision and this person's, I don't know what. And when I was a legislator, I had resolved before going in to stay out of things like that. And I was immediately shoved into them by those that decided to make that their
I don't think you can.
I mean, legislator.
When you're in the legislature, you have to deal with the hand that's dealt you, and even the legislative leaders. I mean, they don't have any control. These members were elected from their districts. They have every right to introduce the bills they think are important.
Yes, they do.
And everybody's obliged to debate them. One thing to your point about whether or not they're representing, we had the general election race between Rick Becker, who I think is an avatar of sorts for the wing of the Republican Party that we're talking about.
Yeah, he's an imperfect one on the ballot box, but keep going.
But his people that vote for him, I mean, they're the ones who are also pushing a lot of these bills, that want to see a lot of this culture war stuff.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the difference between, because he was also a candidate during if you look at how the districts voted between Hoeven and Becker at the NDGOP convention, the percentage of the people who were who participated in that convention process versus how the general electorate voted on the June primary ballot, there is Becker versus Hoeven, to the extent that those two men are representative of the divide in the Republican Party. There is a distinct difference where the convention process for the NDGOP is not producing results that are in line with what the larger electorate seems to want as measured by their votes. And that is a big problem for the NDGOP. But I'm going to be getting into that in my weekend column. Ben, we got to wrap it up here. Thank you so much for your time.
Good.
Did you know Forum Communications Company has a robust podcast library? At inforum.com/podcasts, we have everything from politics, sports, true crime, outdoor adventure, and more. Visit inforum.com/podcasts and explore them all today.